Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name's TB Sky, and what you've got on screen in front of you right now is the trailer for a 2017 movie called Loving Vincent. What is remarkable about Loving Vincent is that every single frame, everything you see, everything that happens in the film is animated in oil paint. Now, animation fundamentally is always a push and a pull between what you have the time and budget to do and what you want to do. It is a tug of war between your ambition and your creative vision and just the time and manpower you have available to make this real. This, of course, is true of pretty much all types of creative projects, but especially for animation, you always have to make trade-offs between how many frames can I afford to draw, to have people sit down and draw for my film, versus how many do I need to achieve the thing I want to achieve. That math is difficult at the best of times. It's difficult when you have all the modern technology and all the digital animation tools that you could possibly want available to you. It is even more spectacularly difficult when you choose to work in a medium that is so fundamentally hostile, on the face of it anyway, to animation as oil paint. I bring this up because Loving Vincent is a film that, regardless of what you think of the plot or the characters or the way it's constructed or the filmography or the direction or whatever, just being able to do something like this with the medium that they have chosen and the visual style that they decided on is a remarkable technical accomplishment. It's the kind of thing that theoretically really shouldn't be possible until someone made it possible. It's a spectacularly interesting movie. I don't know if it's good because I haven't had the opportunity to see it, but I want to, just because who the hell else does something like this ever? When do you ever see anyone do anything remotely like this? Well, if you looked at the thumbnail and title of this video, you might know where I'm kind of trying to go with this. This is Annie Origins, the new short animated short film, by Riot Games. Those were the words I was looking for, detailing the origins and the backstory of the character Annie. The comparisons are perhaps obvious. Annie looks like a painting. All of what's happening here looks like a moving painting, and it is in many ways stunningly beautiful, but it isn't. Well, it is beautiful, but it is not an animated painting. In fact, Annie is a 3D animated short, mostly. I want to talk about this because, like I said with Vincent, there's always this trade-off in animation between what you have the budget and the time to do and what you want to achieve from a visual standpoint. And for me, a lot of what makes animation interesting to me is seeing how animators and technicians solve those problems, those difficult choices between how much you have the time and money to do and how much you really want to do. Because Annie Origins is a spectacularly ambitious project. A lot of what I'm going to be basing, a lot of the information I'm going to be basing this video on is stuff that Riot Games themselves have released in the form of a behind-the-scenes video and a post on their Universe Nexus site where they detailed the creation of this film. So if you've already read that and watched that video, well, a lot of the information I'm going to tell you is going to be old hat. And there are going to be links to that down in the description. I recommend you go check it out because from a technical standpoint, it is fascinating. But Annie is a 3D animated feature. The characters are 3D models in the same underlying technology that Blizzard uses to animate their Overwatch shorts, or literally any other video game company would use to animate their short pieces of promotional animation. But it does not, in any sense, look like pretty much anything else I think that's really been done on this kind of scale. And when I say on this kind of scale, I mean the very small scale. This is something that is detailed in the post and the video that I talked about, but this short film was the project of a relatively small team at Riot working with relatively limited resources, as limited as your resources can be at a multi-billion-dollar company as like Riot anyway. And it is very much a story about cutting corners in unusual ways. It all started when Riot some artists at Riot Games looked at the animated splash arts that they had started putting out in the client to promote the release of new champions or new epic skins or whatever, where 2D pictures would be animated with some technology that made them move enough that they kind of looked like animation. So the artists wondered, could we use that to actually animate a full short film? Could we use that technology to cut out some of all the difficult and extensive labor that it would take to produce a film like this in a traditional manner, and use the same technology to do it, air quotes, on the cheap, like with a smaller team able to achieve more with some technology? Now, the short answer to that question is no, not quite. But the long answer is a lot more fascinating, because they went through an extended process of running into dead ends. Of, we want to use this technology to do this thing. Ooh, turns out we can't do that with just this technology. Okay, well then we're going to be using some more technologies and some more technologies. And they kept adding things on top of it that were used to patch over the limitations of their previous approach. For example, they couldn't create the kind of character animation that they needed to tell this story by just using the same technology that they used to animate the splash arts. So they decided to use 3D animation. They used 3D models and a 3D camera to create the short film in a 3D space. But then, in order to achieve the look of a painting that they really wanted for the aesthetic, they then started adding a whole bunch of filters and processing, post-processing, all kinds of things via programs like Adobe After Effects in order to achieve that textured, painterly look that they really wanted, where they combined traditional painting techniques with just automated digital technology in order to get the look that they wanted. And it's really the end product. What's so impressive about the end product is that if you don't know that you're looking at a 3D animation, then you're gonna be fooled. At least for a little while, you're gonna be fooled. The thing that gave it away for me, that this is not a series of paintings being animated, is, well, this. The very, very smooth motion of the camera. Or rather, it was actually a different shot, which I'm gonna find for you. The shot that gave it away for me the first time is this one. Because look at what the camera is doing in this scene. That is a really complicated motion, and that's the point where I was, okay, there's literally no way in hell they animated that by hand. This is a 3D camera, those are 3D models, suspicion confirmed. But I was fooled for quite a while, because it is a remarkably complete illusion. So what are some of the corners that they had to cut in order to achieve what they wanted? Well, what they wanted was to portray the fluidity of memories. They wanted to portray, you know, Annie is a small child, and the trauma that underlies her character is all kind of foggy and messed up in her memory. It's not really a linear progression of time. It's not really reliable. So they wanted to use the paint aesthetic. They wanted to use all this fuzziness and all this sort of liquidity, the sort of liquid quality that you get from something like oil paint, like this kind of look that you can only really get from an aesthetic like what oil paint enables you to have. In fact, visually, what the Annie short reminds me most of is paintings by Rembrandt, who used this very rough painterly technique, especially later in his career, to achieve the very specific, very stylized, very rough look of his paintings that became very celebrated long after his death, as is always the case. They wanted that, but they couldn't possibly get enough people and manpower and expertise together to do it the real way. So a series of compromises had to be made along the way. First, they compromised by putting in 3D models. Then they have to put a bunch of filters over top of it in order to achieve the correct effect. And then, even after all of that, and after animating the hair, the hair is a particularly interesting thing, because all of the hair on the characters, and indeed I think a lot of the dresses and stuff, are animated with that original technology, the technology that they also use to animate the splash arts. These are 2D images that are projected onto the 3D model and then moved around with the same tech that they use to animate their splash screens. But then over the top of that, they had to go in and hand paint. They had to go in and manually correct things. And what's impressive is that I can't tell where they did that. I know for a fact, because I have read that this is so, that artists on certain frames, on certain shots, on certain things that didn't look quite the way they wanted them had to go in and hand paint things over the top to get it to look just right, to get it to look just the way they wanted. And when I watch this short film, and I've watched it several dozen times at this point, I can't tell where that happens. I can't tell where the automated digital technology ends and the handcrafting begins. And that is remarkably, remarkably impressive. I do have a few guesses, though. I think stuff like in the opening shot of the memories, let's see here. I think the stuff like this flame, for instance, was probably hand-painted because this swirling circular motion seems much too specific and much too unique to have been generated solely by a computer. They could have, it's not impossible, but that's the kind of thing I think the artist had to hand paint. I think also when it comes to certain expressions, especially expressions that need to be subtle, like the slow expressions of the father and Annie as she looks over the shoulder of her father when he hugs her, which he's about to do at some point once he's done talking. There we go. This. All the subtle motions of her eyes, those tiny little motions, the little motions of the eyelids, the little crooking of the mouth, I think that probably had to be hand corrected. And I think stuff like smear frames, which happen, for instance, when the mother turns around, what you're about to see is, look at the sides of her arm, you can see these smears, almost like someone went in and dragged the paint with a palette knife. Those smears, I think, were also added by hand because that's the kind of thing you do when you need the motion to look more smooth and more sudden than it really is. You can add smear frames like that in order to kind of speed up her momentum, to make it look a little bit more violent than it really is. Finally, I'm also reasonably certain that a lot of what's going on with the water in this scene is hand painted. Specifically, I think most of the rolling waters are probably generated by the computer, but the splashes around the rocks and around things that enter the stream, I'm reasonably sure that these are hand painted, because when I look at them, I see a lot of flecks of paint. I see a lot of sort of very specific and slightly clumsy, and I say that with massive air quotes, slightly simplistic, and you can see here again smear frames being used to heighten the speed of the motion, being used to, and you can also see here where it's kind of like the splash just kind of appears around her feet. It's not like the computer generates it around her. I think someone painted these splashes on top of what's going on here. And it's stuff like that where an artist has had to go in and make creative choices about where to paint stuff over what the computer and the filters were already generating. What interests me most about animation is those cut corners. And in traditional animation, usually you have to cut corners in order to kind of try and, air quotes, cheat your way to making it look more realistic than it really is, to make it look smoother, more realistic, like you have put in more effort than you really have. You're constantly trying to cheat the eye of the viewer into perceiving more motion than you can actually put in there. Like when you animate, you can't animate everything at 100 frames per second. You simply can't. There's never enough time. There's never enough manpower to do that. So you always have to make choices about, okay, here I'm going to cut a corner and animate that at a slightly lower quality so I can spend more time on the other thing in order to make that look better. So for traditional animation, it's always a push and pull between, I could make it look smoother, but I don't have the resources, so I have to try and cheat my way to make it look smoother. The interesting thing about this short is that it kind of approaches the same problem from the opposite direction, because this is 3D animation. They could make everything perfectly smooth just because the computer can generate as many frames as they want. They could make it look perfectly smooth, but they're constantly making choices about when not to make it smooth. And this scene in particular is a prime example. First, like I noted, here's the camera. Look how smooth, how long, how direct, and how sweeping this camera movement is. That would be incredibly difficult to do in traditional hand-drawn animation. Like, you would have to cheat your way around a lot of things in order to make a shot like that work. But now, let's pause it here and take a look at the flames. I'm going to advance the scene 1 frame at a time. And you can hear my hand pressing the button to advance it 1 frame at a time. And take a look at the flames. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the camera moves on every single frame, but the flames only move on every 4th frame. And interestingly, the little embers that you can see climbing around her feet there, look how their motion isn't quite synchronized with the rest of the flames either. In traditional animation, this is the kind of thing you would do in order to make the scene appear to be more real, more chaotic, more unsynchronized than it really is. If you think back to traditional 1920s Disney shorts from the cinema era, the silly symphonies and merry melodies of the time, you would have those big scenes where characters are kind of moving to some music and it's all kind of looping around and around over and over again, and everybody is moving at the same beat, in the same rhythm, completely synchronized with each other, and it kind of looks a little weird. And that's because in real life, everything doesn't synchronize with each other smoothly. Things move at different tempos, with different rhythms, at different speeds. And so in traditional animation, you mimic that by moving one thing on one frame and moving another thing on another frame. Even if your frame rate is quite low, you try to sort of desynchronize things so that everything doesn't move too much on the same frames. And that is a hack. Like, that's you're trying to cheat your way into making things look more real than they actually are. Things aren't moving smoothly, but you make them look more smooth by choosing the exact pace with which you animate the thing. In 3D animation, you don't really have that problem because the computer can render everything at a cool 30 to 60 frames per second, no problem. Like, for instance, this camera movement. But the artists have made a creative choice that because they want it to look hand animated, because they want to have that feeling, they want it to look like they had to cut different corners than they actually had to cut. So the corner they had to cut is to find a way to make this 3D generated, and I believe the flames are 3D generated. Flames look like they were handcrafted when in fact they weren't. This is one of the things they detail in one of their posts, is they tried to take a bunch of videos of flames and apply some different filters to it to make it look like paintings. And one of the things they found was that if they let the flames move at high frame rates, if they let them move too smoothly, they wouldn't look right. They would look wrong. They would look too good, and they wouldn't look like they were hand animated by someone who had to cut corners. They would look like they were real, too real, and that would ruin the look of the film. And that is such an interesting problem to have, because, you know, for most of animation history, it was the complete opposite problem. You had to try your very hardest to make it look more real than it is. But here, they have to make things look more primitive than they really are in order to achieve the look, the feeling, the aesthetic that they're going for. And I know I'm rambling on about this for so long, but it is so impressive the ways that they've done that. Because remember, the flames moved on 4-frame intervals, right? When we looked at them extending from Annie's feet. And here, as Annie's father moves through the flames, look at the frame rates that they've chosen to move at. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7... Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, this is a 3D model. It can move as smoothly as you want, but they choose, because the scene is wild and chaotic, and because there's a lot of action going on, if you were animating this traditionally, you would have to cut a lot of corners to make this scene work. You couldn't do everything on screen right now at 30 frames per second, so you would choose to lower the frame rate in order to get the motion across and in order to heighten the sense of the chaos that's going on in the scene. But now look, when he spots her. 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 4, 1, 2, 3. Suddenly there's more frames. Suddenly he moves somewhat smoother. And here, where he embraces her, It's 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. It's a much smoother frame rate in certain shots, and that again is interesting because in traditional animation, when you want characters to have emotional connections and emotional moments, you want to communicate complicated things with their expressions, you have to heighten you have to use more frames to do it. You have to move things slower. You have to move things more subtly. And this is something that this short also replicates perfectly. When you have a character on screen who's doing something that requires us to identify a complex emotion, their faces, like the mother looking at the pictures here, or let's see, when Annie, or like the crying that's going on here, or this scene here where the characters are relating to each other emotionally. There's a much higher frame rate than there are during the action shots, because that's the kind of thing you would need to do in a traditional animation in order to make those scenes work. I love this. I love the kind of reverse thinking that you kind of have to do in order to make this work the way that you want to. It's, I don't know, maybe I'm the only nerd in the universe who finds this kind of thing interesting, but that, to me, is the most fascinating thing about this short, is not necessarily the many types of technology they had to use in order to achieve the look, but the many choices they had to make about how to use those technologies in order to make it look the way that they wanted, in order to achieve the feeling and the aesthetic that they were going for. That is such a, it's a complicated, fascinating process, and Riot, if any of the people on the team ever see this video, or you ever watch this, or you've ever managed to hear this, put out more stuff. Like, I want to see, breakdowns of individual shots. I want to see exactly the process. I want to know from the artists who made each shot what choices they had to make for what shot to work, and which bits they painted on, and which bits were generated by the computer, and what did you have to change in order to make it look right, because this is so fucking cool. It's so fucking fascinating. And I think at this point I have descended into just fanboy gushing, which is a decent place, I think, to end this video. I might do another video later down the line talking about how this changes Annie's lore, and how that relates to her characterization, and blah blah blah, all my criticisms, which I of course always have. But for now, I've been TB Sky, and this has been 22 minutes of me gushing like a fanboy about the technology and the creative choices that went into making something like this remarkable piece of short film. And if you have any comments, feel free to leave them down below. If you disagree or agree with me, I would love to hear about it. You can leave a like if you're so inclined, or a dislike if that is more your speed, and you can subscribe if you want to watch more videos like this, or other videos of different kinds. I have many different things on my channel, and there's probably something there that you might enjoy. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.